Vincent Simeone has worked in the horticultural field for over 27 years. He has an Associate of Applied Science degree in ornamental horticulture from SUNY Farmingdale, a Bachelor of Science degree in ornamental horticulture from the University of Georgia, and a master's degree in public administration from CW Post Long Island University. Vincent specializes in woody plant ID, culture, use, and selection of superior varieties. An experienced lecturer, instructor, and horticultural consultant, he has spoken to many groups nationwide and has appeared on several garden shows, including Martha Stewart Living and HGTV. When not chatting on garden shows or giving lectures, Vincent teaches horticulture classes at New York Botanical Garden. For over 20 years, Vincent has worked in public horticulture at Planting Fields Arboretum State Historic Park in New York, where he is the director. Since 2005, he has published 6 books. In 2010, he was named Man of the Year by the Long Island Nursery and Landscape Association, and in 2014, he was awarded the Centurion Award by Farmingdale State College as the top 100 alumni over the past century. In 2015, he was awarded the Distinguished Arborist Award from the NYS Arborist ISA chapter.
And welcome. So we're going to talk about sustainable gardening today, which is a very, of course, important topic, a very hot topic these days, and especially now with the emphasis on gardening and the emphasis on growing our own food and being more organic, and certainly the thought about climate change and how we have to protect our environment and the earth. So I think this is a very timely lecture. This is based on a book that I recently released called Sustainable Gardening: Grow a Greener, Low Maintenance Landscape with Fewer Resources. And it's really all about having less of a negative impact to our environment and still having a beautiful garden that is welcome to pollinators and birds, and less pesticides and more organics and more native plants. So we're going to get started. We have a lot to cover, and we're going to cover a lot of aspects of sustainable gardening, which are literally chapters within the book. So let's get started. So, obviously, in the last couple of years, and just this year, the East Coast certainly has seen a lot of storms coming up the coast, a lot of activity, a lot of unusual activity, a lot of rainfall in the Northeast. Just in New York, 2 weeks ago, we received 5 or 6 inches of rain in the last, 4 or 5 hours of the last storm. So those have a tremendous impact to our environment, a lot of erosion. Then you go to the West Coast and you see all the wildfires and all the drought that you see on the West Coast, and record temperatures in the Pacific Northwest. So the environment's changing, the climate's changing, and there's a lot of debate right now as to why that's happening, and is it really, human activity that's causing that? So certainly there's a lot of data to support the fact that our environment's getting warmer. The average temperatures are getting warmer, and in 2016, 2012, the USDA changed the hardiness zone map, the plant hardiness zone map, and most of the United States has gotten a half a zone warmer, and that has an impact. It has an impact to plants and water and soil and everything else. So we certainly are concerned about that, and we need to do a better job being more sustainable in our landscape. That's the first place. It all starts at home. And this is the hardiness zone map, which shows, the change. And, as an example, New York, Long Island, where I'm from, used to be zone 7A, and now it's zone 7B, which doesn't sound like much, but that's definitely 4 or 5 degrees difference, which is substantial. And with that, the other thing we have to consider is that heat and humidity is more of an issue than it used to be, at least in the Northeast. And so plants react differently to heat and humidity, or more heat and humidity, and more disease, and all those things. So there's more extremes than they used to be. And I think within my lifetime, I've seen that there's more extremes in our climate and in our environment. And the heat zone map, which was put together by the American Horticultural Society, is another really good tool to just see and sort of track. This was done in the early 90s. Just to really track, how heat and humidity has changed in the United States over the last 30 or so years. So all of these factors are things we need to consider when we are selecting plants and when we're growing a lawn or not growing a lawn or using native plants, composting. We need to be more responsible with the way we use pesticides or fertilizers, and maybe those things are overused sometimes. So those are all things we need to consider. And so I'm not going to read this whole thing, but to define sustainability really is all about an ecosystems and a diverse ecosystem that can be viable long term. And if we think about it from the standpoint of horticulture and gardening, we need to have a diverse landscape, a landscape with a lot of different species of plants that sort of work together cohesively. Because a biological system that's diverse is a healthy system, and it's a system that can endure and adapt. And so when we have just turf or just trees and no diversity, that's when we run into problems. And so it's all about having this belief that we can persevere when we have a ecosystem that's diverse. And so sustainability really encompasses a lot of things. Certainly recycling is something we'll talk about, and I think we do a much better job recycling than we used to as a society. But recycling takes a lot of resources and a lot of money to do that. And it's something we have to continue to push forward with, because we have to reuse, recycle whenever we can. Water conservation, I don't think we do a good enough job at that. I think we take for granted water. I think it's a resource that is probably much more economical to use than electric, for instance. And often water is wasted, and often our landscapes are overwatered. Just in the Northeast, our precipitation is up 71% over the last 10 years. And we're still watering our landscapes the same way as we did 30 years ago. And that is really, overwatering our landscapes. And that's causing a lot of problems with soil, with disease. And that's something that we have to look at, is better conserving water and better use of water to have a healthy landscape. Energy conservation is certainly something I think we do a pretty good job with. And there's a lot of energy efficient systems now, lighting systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems. And those are all great things, but we need to continue that trend. Using green products, using products that aren't so detrimental to the environment. There's a lot of regulations now with dishwashing detergent and laundry detergent and detergents in general that are more regulated now, and that's great. And we need to do that. We need to have more of these green products, and that includes pesticides that are more organic and have less of an impact on the environment in a negative way. Composting can replace the use of chemical fertilizers. If we compost, we're feeding our garden naturally with recycled material from our garden, which is very sustainable, of course. And it also feeds our plants in a very natural way. And so I encourage everybody, if you don't compost, you should definitely compost in your garden. IPM is integrated pest management, and it's a way to integrate different forms of pest control to properly and efficiently control pests without just the use of chemicals. It's not about just going to the chemicals all the time. It's maybe using other methods like crop rotation, pest-resistant plants, right plant for the right place, of course, and maybe using organics like horticultural soaps and oils instead of some of these very detrimental chemicals. And then, of course, the last part of this lecture is going to be proper plant selection. Putting the right plant in the right place and using superior varieties of plants, especially native plants that support native wildlife and support this idea that these native plants are more resilient. They can take these extremes in the climate better, and they can take these heavy rainfalls and heat and humidity better than a lot of other plants. So and our impact on the environment is evident: pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, our carbon footprint, things like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane are all human-induced emissions that do have an impact on the environment, and that could be things that are causing a lot of this climate change. Pesticide and fertilizer use, we need to be more responsible with that. It's not that pesticides and fertilizers don't have a use, but the overuse and the misuse of them is what's a problem. And if there's an alternative to them and we can use more organic products, that's a much better way to go. Water use and lack of water conservation initiatives, as I said, that we'll talk about that. The impacts humans have to the animal kingdom is evident in many things. I think the most common one you see these days that people are talking about is the lack of the migration of the monarch butterfly, and why are the numbers so down? Why are the monarch butterfly numbers and the migration so reduced? And that has a lot to do with human impact to their ecosystem, to their habitat. And so there's a lot of conservation efforts now to replant milkweed and plants that the caterpillars can feed on and to eventually become adults. And we have made an impact over the last couple of years. We have seen the numbers go back up a bit, and just think if we continue that trend, how those numbers could go back up. And then humans as consumers and lack of recycling energy consumption issues. I think we need to do a better job of continuing to recycle, to continue to have less of an impact on the energy grid, on the electrical grid, and look for ways to be more sustainable. And so I show this picture. This is a picture of a moss garden in Kyoto, Japan. And it is about 1,000 years old, about 1,200 years old, this garden. And it was built by man, but really very untouched, very much left natural for the last 9 centuries or so, or 10 centuries or so. And very little is done to it. This is all about nature. And what this picture symbolizes to me is that to be sustainable, you need to work with nature and not against it. We can't control nature, as we know, and we need to work within the boundaries of nature and work with nature instead of against it. And so this is a perfect example of this is man-made, but certainly nature is what makes this happen. If the soil and the light and the rainfall wasn't perfect, this moss would not grow here. So we need to look at those things and make sure that we're working in tandem with nature. So some beautiful pictures of this wonderful moss garden, which is centuries old. And we need to do a better job of looking at what happens in nature and doing as similar a job to that as possible. What I mean by that is plants that grow in environments where they're native or where they're adapted to grow, that's where we should put them. So if a plant is adapted for shade like this, we should put it in shade and give it the same conditions that would want in its native habitat, even though it's in a garden setting. We too often put plants where they look good and not where they want to grow. And that's when we run into problems. Plants get stressed, they don't adapt well, and then we have disease and insects and other things that make them not perform so well. So I think we need to do a better job of looking at where plants want to grow and putting them in those situations where they can thrive and they are at their best. So looking at this layered landscape and looking at nature and paying attention to nature more is an important thing. If you look at American dogwood and where it grows in its native habitat, it grows on the edges of woodland, usually on an eastern exposure where it gets morning sunlight and afternoon shade. But time and time again, we see dogwoods being planted on the western exposure where they get afternoon sun, and that can be very detrimental to them. So doing a better job of just seeing where plants grow in their native habitat and then trying to replicate that is a great thing. And we do want these very colorful, very pristine landscapes, but this is not really very sustainable. It's hard to sustain this without chemicals, without heavy water use, without fertilizers and things like that. So maybe there's a way to compromise. I think sustainability is all about compromise, and it's all about maybe not having the perfect lawn, maybe not having perfectly large, lush flowers, but having plants that are more organically grown, and maybe tolerating a little bit of weeds in your grass and things like that, but still having a very beautiful landscape. So we're going to talk about those compromises. And you can kind of see here this house. We very often in new developments, you see this beautiful house that they spent a lot of time and money building, but very little thought into the landscape. And there's no diversity in this picture. There's no diversity whatsoever. There's no enticement for pollinators to come in here. There's a monoculture lawn there that is maintained very much traditionally like a lawn would be maintained, which is not very sustainable, and no diversity whatsoever. So we need to change this trend. And you can kind of see here, this is a much different scenario. There's a little strip of grass in this picture, which is okay. The grass has a place in the landscape, but maybe not an entire 2-acre lawn, maybe just a smaller patch of grass. And then this very diverse, very naturalistic landscape with plants that want to grow in the same conditions all put together. They all look good together and they're all thriving. This is a habitat for pollinators and birds, and it's also very aesthetically pleasing. This was taken in England, and I think the Europeans do a great job of creating these sustainable landscapes. And you can kind of see it again here, these light colors, yellows and pastels that look quite beautiful together. And this is a very sustainable landscape. I have a friend of mine who teaches horticulture classes at a place called Farmingdale State College, and he actually designed and built with the students a sustainable garden that shows the different aspects of a sustainable garden. And that includes a compost facility, that includes using native plants. He built a meadow. He put in beehives. He has an orchard. And all of this is maintained with zero chemicals and with a lot of these sustainable initiatives put in place. And so sustainable gardens don't have to be wild. You know, a lot of people think that sustainable gardens are ones that just are wild and messy, and that's not the case. They're very actually contrived and very designed very well in order for them to work. Hopefully, at the end of the day, a sustainable garden is more self-sufficient. Hopefully, it's low maintenance. And places like in Sweden, they do this very well. They mow the front yard, but they'll leave patches of the backyard more natural like this, which attracts pollinators and is less maintenance. Less mowing. Less mowing means less fuel emissions, right? Less fossil fuel emissions because you're using less mowing and less gas. So there are compromises you can do in the landscape. And, you know, the meadow movement is a big movement now. This is obviously a very large commercial meadow on a commercial site. Not everyone's going to be able to do this, but at the same time, on a small scale, maybe you could do this in certain areas of your yard where it's not so noticeable or where it's not so visible to the rest of your neighbors. At Longwood Gardens, they do a great job of trialing different mowing methods. In this case, they were mowing the turf very long. A longer turf is a more healthy turf. It's denser. It's more. It's less stressed. The shorter you cut your grass, the more drought prone it's going to be. It's going to dry out quicker. It's going to be more, more vulnerable to pests and diseases. And at Longwood, they were just testing mowing heights here, and they mowed it the grass very tall, and left it that way for the winter months. So you should never mow your grass too short in times of drought, and you should not mow your grass too short in the winter. A lot of people like to make their final cut in the winter and cut their grass very low. I wouldn't do that. I would actually raise your mowing deck and leave your grass about 3 or 4 inches tall for the winter. This is short grass. It looks beautiful. There's not a weed in this grass, but it took a lot of chemicals and a lot of fertilizer to keep it this way. And again, the shorter you cut your grass, the more vulnerable it really is. At certain times you might be able to lower your mowing deck a bit, but this is too short really to be more sustainable. And, you know, I obviously realize that you probably are not going to mow your grass with a reel mower. A reel mower is great because there's no emissions at all, of course. It's not run by a motor. But if you have a small patch of grass, maybe you do this, or maybe you do a mulching mower that will mulch up the grass and chop it up rather than you bagging the grass and taking it away. You know, this is a mulching mower that has no bag. The grass clippings are left on the lawn. They will be composted. And the nitrogen will go back into the soil and feed the grass. So it's a very sustainable way to do that. And so, you know, that's a very short cut. And over time, you really should think about raising that mower blade. The more you raise it, the more healthy that grass is going to be and the less stress it's going to be. And the other thing is there's some exciting real technology out there of getting away from motorized mowers, motorized weed trimmers, motorized blowers, and using battery-powered devices. And they're really, the technology is there. You could mow your grass for an hour and a half with a battery-powered mower and have no emissions spewed into the atmosphere. This is mowing methods at a college in California, where they raised their mowing decks to about 3.5 inches and didn't remove the grass clippings. They left this long for the summer because they had such drought restrictions and water restrictions. And this is what the grass looked like. It was a little bit long, but it certainly endured much better than if it had been cut short. So these are things you want to do. You don't want to mow in times of drought. You want to water infrequently but deeply when you do water. And in this case, they were watering, once or twice a week. There are alternatives to turf as well. There are things like ground covers, what I call weed suppressive ground covers. In my book, I talk about weed suppressive ground covers. And I talk about these things like carex and sedges, ornamental grasses, all kinds of perennials that you can use in lieu of turf that can still give you that low vegetation and would only be mowed once a year rather than every week. And this is actually a design in Rhode Island, this is a design of what's called a lawnless garden, a garden that has no lawn whatsoever. And it's replaced by mulch and stone and gravel. And so you can kind of see here the ground covers and the stonework they use rather than using turf. So this is very sustainable. And you can kind of see the design they put here. Very low maintenance plants, very drought tolerant plants, and a very permeable landscape. A landscape that is going to absorb water rather than having any kind of runoff. And that's really very sustainable. I have a friend of mine in Atlanta that took her lawn out and put in a patchwork design of ground covers. This is black mondo grass and I believe a plant called creeping Jenny in a patchwork design. And sure that she has to go in there and weed it once in a while and things like that, but she certainly doesn't have to mow it all but once a year. And it's really very, very beautiful and very sustainable. So this is a nice idea. Ground covers, I do mention in my book, ground covers that could replace turf. Why would you want to put turf here and then mow this hill? Much better to use ground covers like this Russian arborvitae. It's all about the soil with sustainability. You need to look at soil pH. Take a soil pH test once in a while. Take a soil test that shows you what nutrients you have in the soil. It's really impossible to garden and impossible to have plants that expect them to thrive without having the right soil for that plant. So, every few years, take a soil sample. At my facility, we compost on a much different level, a much more commercial level. Botanical gardens have that ability, but it's really all the same principle. If you got a leaf shredder and shredded up your leaves or your small twigs, you could do the same thing as this. You can create your own mulch. So shredding your leaves and using that as a compost or as a top dress in your garden is really a great way to be more sustainable and feed your garden. Instead of taking all these leaves and bagging them up in the fall and throwing them out where they go to a landfill like this, that's carbon that you could be using in your landscape. And you don't have to use every single leaf, but maybe you save a third of those leaves and compost them. That mulch, that pine straw, that is a vital piece to the puzzle as far as sustainability. There are a lot of beneficial organisms in that soil that are going to consume this organic matter and feed your plants. Quality mulch is important. These dyed mulches, I'm not a big fan of. There's chemicals in there that are going to inhibit plant growth and inhibit beneficials. If you're going to use mulch from an outside source, make sure it's clean, make sure that it is natural. And a good mulch job, only an inch or two is all you need. You don't need much more than that. It can be certainly a great look in the garden. And also mulch does a lot for plants. It moderates soil temperature and water. It keeps weeds down. It suppresses weeds. It keeps those roots cool in the summer and insulates them in the winter. And it looks good. And the most important thing is as this mulch decomposes, it feeds your plants. And, this scenario on the left is much better than the scenario on the right. If you're going to do a mulch ring around a tree, make sure it's at least to the drip line. Make sure it's at least to where those branches come out. Don't put these little rings that are only going to maybe keep the weed whacker away from the trunk of the tree, but not much more than that. Because there's a whole biology in the soil, and you see these trees here, and you see the tree on the right with the leaves underneath it. We basically leave the leaves under our trees for the most part, and you can't always do that. It would be hard to do that at a public garden where you don't have a lot of room. One of these pocket gardens, it's going to be hard to do that. But maybe composting some of these leaves and using them under these large trees. The bottom left here is a microscopic organism known as a beneficial fungi called mycorrhizae, and it feeds off the organic matter and then attaches itself to the roots of those trees and becomes an extension of that root system. And so it's very beneficial to the trees and the shrubs and everything else you have in your garden. So mulch, leaves, composting, all very good for your garden and very sustainable. Don't put mulch volcanoes in. This will be a slow death for these trees, and too much of a good thing is not good either. You don't want to have 5, 6, 7 inches of mulch around your trees. An inch or 2 is just fine. Composting, I would highly recommend. In the book, I talk about good materials you can use to compost with and the ones that you shouldn't be using. There are things that are just trash that you have to throw out. Meat and charcoal briquettes and cooked food, those are all things you should throw out. But things like grass clippings and hedge trimmings and scraps from your kitchen, those can be composted and used in your garden. So good raw materials, you can use these compost bins. You can buy them pre-made, or you can make your own compost bin. But it's all about those microorganisms and those worms and all those beneficials that are going to consume that material and give you that compost that you want. Water conservation is important, and how you use your irrigation systems is important. Irrigation systems are more efficient and more cost-effective than ever before. But if you use them improperly, it really doesn't matter. So making sure that you have a set system where you just only rely on your automated clock is important. When you're away and you have to, set your clock, completely understood. But when you're in your garden, actively working in your garden, in your home, you should really have more control over your irrigation clock. And you should be watering infrequently, but deeply when you do water. So as an example, instead of watering every single day for a half hour, you should be watering maybe every third day for an hour or an hour and a half, depending on the soil types that you have. So the landscape gets watered less often, but more deeply, so that that water is going to penetrate the soil and encourage a much better root system. It's also going to make sure that your landscape isn't wet all the time, which can encourage disease. And there are very efficient systems now. There are drip irrigation systems that you can buy very cheaply and put in. There are permeable pavers. You can build a permeable paver driveway or walkway or roadway, and while they're more expensive up front, they will allow you to the driveways will absorb the water. The systems will absorb the water instead of there being water runoff, which creates more pollution. So these permeable systems are quite nice. Collecting rainwater. In some states it's prohibited, in other states it's not. If you collect rainwater and you have it in a cistern or a barrel where it's closed so the mosquitoes can't breed in it, you can use that water, not to drink, of course, but certainly to feed or water your plants, your greenhouse plants, your vegetables, your lawn, things of that nature. And they're actually building cisterns now that will actually connect to your irrigation system, and you can water using rainwater for your irrigation system. So the technology is there. This is a cistern or rain barrel in Sweden that they were using as a bench, but it was also tied into their leader system for their house, and it was collecting rainwater. Rain gardens, a way to divert water or a way to take an area that floods every once in a while when it rains and landscape it. Plants are great filters, and they'll filter out the impurities in this water as the water runs through them. And so you can kind of see this gentleman on the right is building this rain garden, and on the left you can see how those plants work. So you have to pick plants, of course, that can take occasional flooding, but they also will, the impurities will be filtered out with these plants with the water going through them. This is on a more commercial level. The one on the bottom right is the Center for Green Technology in Chicago. The one on the top left is the Morton Arboretum, and they actually have an entire parking lot that's permeable, so it absorbs water rather than repels water. And they also have native plants in the islands here that require a lot less care and are also good for pollinators. That's very sustainable. This is in California, in San Jose, where they had a rain garden that was mainly turf, mainly grass, and they mowed it once a year. That's it. That's all they did. And it actually was able to collect rainwater when it rained. Permeable parking lots. This is a permeable parking lot project that actually the parking lot is like a big sponge, and it absorbs up to 5 inches of water an hour, believe it or not. And why is that important is because runoff, there's a lot of impurities in that rainwater when it hits the ground, and you don't want runoff. It can compromise the water table and the drinking water system. So having these systems that will absorb water and when you have less runoff is a good thing. So here's this parking lot that was built, and it's wonderful. It's got permeable pathways and permeable roadways, and is very sustainable. And you can actually pour water right through it rather than water repelling off of it. And so that's a roadway that absorbs water. There's some great technology with solar powered lighting with what's called composite lumber that's recycled plastic and wood shavings. And it's very sustainable. It's a recycled product, lasts for up to 40 years. So certainly would be less pressure on wood products and harvesting of wood and growing of wood. And it is a very lovely way to do it. It also does not need to be stained or painted. It can be left natural. So there's less chemicals. This is a golf course on Long Island that is doing very sustainable things. And it is a traditional golf course, but they're doing a lot of things to create habitat and to plant native plants for pollinators and birds. And so you can kind of see the rough areas way in the back. They actually have native grasses all throughout the golf course. They're actually certified by National Audubon, and they do create habitat for birds and other wildlife. And so they have these wonderful natural areas amongst the golf course, and you can see it. You know, these birds are in this area hunting right around the golfers. It's pretty amazing. And if you build habitat and water, you have a water source, a food source, and habitat, you will have birds and pollinators in your garden. There's no question. 35% of our food crops are pollinated. We need pollinators. We need to protect pollinators, especially native pollinators, and especially native birds. Dr. Doug Talamay from University of Delaware does a great job. In some of his books, he talks a lot about how native plants support native pollinators and how important that is. And if you build it, they will come. Bat boxes are important too. Birds will eat up to 1,000 insects during the day. Bats will eat up to 1,000 insects at night. And bats, what do they eat? They eat mosquitoes and moths and Japanese beetles and things that we don't want in the garden. So although we don't want bats near our back door, if you build a bat box and put it out in the distance, up about 15 feet, you will encourage bats to be in the area. Native plants. Beth Page does a great job with planting things like butterfly weed and echinaceas, and they do have a lot of native pollinators in that golf course. And that's the same thing, you know, if you spray a lot, you're not going to have these beneficials. You're going to kill as many of the beneficials, if not more, than if you had, you know, just left it alone. And so, you know, lady beetles and many of these insects are going to be very efficient in controlling pests. We have a rose garden at the Arboretum that gets no spraying whatsoever, and the beneficials more than keep the bad insects in check. And these are aphids that are being devoured. So don't spray your garden unless you have to. Encourage native bees, native pollinators, bumblebees, sweat bees, minor bees. And how to do that? Plant native plants like echinacea. Here's a native bee called a sweat bee. I love people who say to me they want butterflies, but they don't want caterpillars eating up their garden. With sustainability, you have to take the good and the bad. You're going to have plants that are going to have holes in them. You're going to have plants that are going to be devoured by these caterpillars because they need that to sustain themselves to become adults. And there's a lot of plants that will feed the adults, but not a lot of plants that'll feed the caterpillars. In fact, there's really one genus, Asclepius, that will feed the pollinator, the caterpillars, in this case of monarch. I have parsley that got totally decimated by black swallowtail caterpillars, and I let them have it because that's what sustainability is all about. And in general, habitat needs to be created if you want box turtles, which eat slugs, and frogs that eat a lot of nasty insects as well, and certainly snakes that eat rodents, and dragonflies, which can be very beneficial. In my book, I talk about birds, native birds especially, that if you build habitat and you plant certain landscape plants, you will encourage those birds to come into the garden, and that's important too, because birds are an important part of the ecosystem. Sure, bird houses and bird feeders are good. They're a supplement, but they're not the end-all be-all. Birds need to eat insects, and they need to eat seeds and berries. And so planting plants that are going to give them those seeds and berries and give them that habitat they need is important. This is Doug Talamay's work, where he talks about butterfly and moth species that are supported by native plants. Oaks are very, very important to our ecosystem and to our pollinators and birds and mammals and many other things. Black cherry, even though can be a weedy tree in the landscape, especially in the mid-Atlantic states, is very important for pollinators. So these are just some of the things like willow and birch, crabapple, that are all important for pollinators. And this is a native and non-native butterfly garden that can be very beautiful design, but also very sustainable. And just a couple of perennials and shrubs that I'll mention that I think will help you in your pursuit of sustainable plants that will be low maintenance and will also attract wildlife into the garden. This is a plant called yarrow, or Kelia, and it comes in a wide variety of colors. But even though this is a non-native plant, it's not invasive, and it's very, very attractive to pollinators, especially butterflies. So I really like yarrow as a sustainable plant. Certainly butterfly weed and milkweed are both very good for pollinators, bees, and butterflies, and they're also very beautiful. So this is Asclepius tuberosa, which is a wonderful perennial that is summer blooming into fall, easily reseeds in the landscape, and it gives you that really naturalistic landscape. It's very good to mix this with native grasses. And there are other colors. There's pink, there's white, but these are all different types of milkweeds and butterfly weeds. Asters, having something for the insects to feed on in the fall. We can't forget about the fall. Things like asters and mums and sedums, especially, all good for pollinators in the fall. Coreopsis, or tickseed rather, is a great perennial for the summer, but also a great plant for pollinators. And the seeds, it's called tickseed because it has very tiny seeds that small birds will feed on. So finches and sparrows and things will feed on the small seed of Coreopsis. Certainly echinacea, there are some great varieties of echinacea out there. I love the Pow Wow series, and I love the Cheyenne Spirit series. And, they're a little more compact. They don't flop as much. And you can use them in a garden like this. And certainly echinacea or coneflower is important for the garden. This is one called Pow Wow Wildberry. Perennial geraniums. There are annual geraniums, which are a totally different plant, but these are perennial geraniums that actually will be good in sun or shade and be good ground covers, but they're also excellent for pollinators and excellent in a sustainable landscape. They're good in both shade and sun, as I mentioned, and they're called cranesbill, a very good perennial. Daylilies and a goldenrod mixture here. This is goldenrod that's quite compact, and this is one called Fireworks, I believe. And these are loved by pollinators. Pollinators love these two plants. Native grasses, rather than going to the more invasive exotic grasses, maybe try some of these native grasses. So on the left is miscanthus, which is a non-native, and we have it controlled here by the turf. But on the top right, this is a native plant garden at the New York Botanical Garden. And they feature 20 or 30 different types of native grasses that are quite lovely and very good for a sustainable landscape. In Japan, miscanthus is an invasive, and this is what it does on these hillsides. You see those tiny little people there walking through this field of miscanthus, and it's totally unsustainable. It's an impossible situation here. But there are alternatives to some of these invasive species. This is miscanthus. I'm sorry, this is a plant called panicum or switchgrass, and it's called Dallas blues. And it's just as big as miscanthus, very beautiful. If you have a cat or dog, they can hide in there in the summer, I guess, and keep themselves cool. But this is a plant called Dallas blues, which is really a wonderful switchgrass. And there's a lot of wonderful areas in Washington, D.C. where you have these parks and these green spaces that have these ornamental grasses. And this is switchgrass in the summer on the right, and in the winter, all winter on the left. And you can mix these grasses with things like black-eyed Susan and echinacea and things of that nature. Big blue stem, little blue stem, these are all native prairie grasses that are being cultivated now for sustainable landscapes. It's impossible to kill blue stem. It's very adaptable. It'll take almost any soil and situation you give it, and it'll keep coming back. It's blue in the summer and a beautiful auburn color or golden color in the winter. And this is a truly sustainable plant. You can kind of see blue in the summer on the bottom right, and golden, sort of a beautiful golden purple color in the winter, fall and winter. This is a little blue stem. In Australia, they practice water-wise gardens. A lot of times there'll be restrictions on watering. You can't water or mow your front yard a lot of times in Australia. And this gentleman actually built a meadow in his front yard. And this is a hard sell, I understand that, in suburbia, in downtown Washington or even New York. But what a beautiful choice of plants, and what a beautiful alternative here to a mowed lawn. So maybe you do that in your backyard. The Toronto Music Garden does a great job building ecosystems, building plant communities of plants that all want to grow in the same situation. So right plant for the right place. That is the key to sustainability. Having plants that want to grow in the same soil, in the same light, in the same conditions together. They all look good and they all work together, and you're not going to find a weed in this garden because they do that over and over again. Maybe you hire a landscape designer, someone, a perspective that can give you perspectives, a designer or a professional, an arborist, or someone who can, give you some advice on how to design your landscape. Sometimes to have that perspective is good. Consider your garden from 6 months out, a year out, 5 years out, 10 years out. Sustainability, besides this idea that you're trying to have a diverse landscape that's got longevity to it, and we think for the long term, we certainly want to think 10, 15, 20 years down the road. We don't want to think season to season. We don't want these disposable landscapes. We want to think long term. So think from the ground up. Do a soil test, check your soils out, check your site, see what plants will grow in your garden, and then redesign your landscape based on what you find. Now, again, think from the ground up. The first thing I would do is do an assessment of your soil and your site and your pH and all those things, and then decide how you're going to, alter your landscape to be more sustainable. Do a sample, garden schedule every year. Mark down if you've got, an insect problem or disease problem in a certain part of the garden. Document that. Write it down. If you fertilize it a certain month, make note of that. When you planted your tomatoes, when you planted your fall crops, make a note of all that. To have a record of what you've done in the garden, what worked and what didn't work, is a great way to be sustainable because it makes you organized. It makes you work on trying to improve every year. Plant quality plants and plant them the right way, whether it's bare root, container, or balled and burlapped. Make sure you plant your plants a bit high, and make sure you give the plants the right soil for their conditions. Don't plant plants too close. These plants are way too close. They're gonna compete with each other very quickly, and we don't do an adequate enough job to give them the room they need, and we create these unsustainable landscapes that have to be, these plants have to be removed in 5 years or 10 years, or they have to, every other one has to be removed. So certainly giving plants more room is important, because those little plants on the left are going to get to those size of those big plants on the right, and we're going to create a more unsustainable situation and have to remove them, and that's not a good situation at all. Shrubs that are, I just think very ideal. And a lot of these shrubs I see at the Botanic Garden there, and they're wonderful, is a winterberry holly is a wonderful plant, great for pollinators and birds, and should be used more. This is Ilex verticillata. And this is a friend of mine, Rebecca Fennerin from Michigan, who took a picture of this winter red holly with no leaves on it, and it is spectacular. So, it doesn't have to be 5 or 6 different things. It can be one simple planting. Things like serviceberry or amelanchier, a native, good for pollinators, good for birds, and also edible fruit. This is serviceberry or amelanchier. Redbuds are native trees that are great for pollinators and good for birds too, and they're very sustainable. They just need good drainage, and they can be very, very diverse and very beautiful in the landscape. Redbud. A plant called clethra. Clethra is a plant called summer sweet, which blooms in August, September. It's very good for pollinators. It's very fragrant and extremely sustainable, extremely adaptable in the landscape. These are the kind of plants you want to put in your garden that will give you as much interest as possible and not a lot of maintenance. And they come in a wide variety of colors, pink and white, different leaf colors, different leaf sizes, different shapes of growth habit. Dogwoods. Dogwoods should be planted on an eastern exposure, as I said, and they usually like morning sunlight and afternoon shade. So just knowing where plants need to grow is where you should site them, rather than where they look good or where they'll fit in the garden. So think about that. Dogwoods can grow in full sun, but they do need more water, more mulch, and more care. There is a couple of good series. This is the Appalachian series. This is Appalachian Spring, which has big giant flowers, bracts, and are more resistant to pests. So that's another thing. You could plant plants that are more resistant to pests. And of course, this is one called Cherokee Brave, which is a pink one. Dogwoods are also good for their fall interest with the fruit and the foliage, but those fruit are also edible for birds, and you will get a lot of birds in your garden. You'll attract a lot of birds in your garden. So they're good for pollinators in the spring, and they're great for birds in the fall. The Rose Garden, the Rockefeller Rose Garden at the New York Botanical Garden, if you're ever in town, you should come see it. It is a very sustainable garden they're using a lot of organic methods. They don't just use traditional methods of spraying and all those things. They're using organic methods too, and they're also using plants that require less spraying, have less disease problems. And they're using a lot of shrub roses that are quite lovely. At our rose garden at Planting Fields, we do the same thing. We're using roses that are low maintenance. We don't do a thing to them. We don't spray them. We don't even fertilize them. We mulch them and we prune them, and that's about it. So you can create even a rose garden that's sustainable. Things like knockout roses and carefree roses and drift roses, all very good. This is the Carefree series, a very nice one called Carefree Wonder, and the drifts on the top right, and the flower carpets on the bottom left. Viburnums in general are pretty sustainable. Now you have to obviously be careful with viburnums. There are some non-native ones that can be invasive. I know in the mid-Atlantic states, there are some that you have to watch out for. But go with a native viburnum. Go with a viburnum that's native, that will have either pink flowers or white flowers and either red fruit or purple fruit like these guys. And they'll feed birds and pollinators. So viburnums in general are great. And this is sort of the crux of sustainability. This is a wisteria that's native to the Pacific Northwest, and it's a native of North America. It's not one of those invasive non-native wisterias, which take a lot of maintenance and also can be very invasive. And so while the flowers aren't as large, it's still a beautiful plant. And so you've compromised the size of the flower a little bit, but you still have a plant that's less maintenance, that's not invasive, and that's still very beautiful. So go with natives and try these things. And even though the flowers may not be as large, you're still going to enjoy this plant. This is one called Amethyst Falls, Wisteria Amethyst Falls. And then, our hemlocks and other evergreens we're losing, unfortunately, because of disease and insects. You think about the emerald ash borer and the spotted lanternfly and all these invasive insects now that are, ruining our ecosystems. We need to continue to diversify the landscape so we don't have, just a very vulnerable landscape that's going to be wiped out by these pests every year. And look around you, look at what's growing native in your native habitat, and try to plant using those native plants. These are plants called Chamaecyparis thioides, which are native Chamaecyparis. Who knew there were native Chamaecyparis? But there are. They look very much like junipers, but they can be very sustainable. And so these Chamaecyparis are quite nice. Arborvitaes, I prefer the Western arborvitae to the Eastern arborvitae because it's very low maintenance. And rather than plant a Leyland cypress, or rather than plant a blue spruce or something else that's just overplanted, maybe some of these things like the green giant arborvitae or the Western arborvitae might be a choice. They hold snow better, they hold wind better, they're better in wind, and they can be a nice screen. And then, this is an oak tree. Oaks are very important, as we know. We need to do a better job planting our hardwoods, planting our natives. Oaks are a very important species, a very important genus in the United States, and they support so much wildlife and so much around them. And we need to do more of a concerted effort to plant some of these natives back in the landscape, these hardwoods, because from that little oak, that little acorn, came this mighty oak. And sometimes you can't fit an oak on your property, right? Well, these are oaks that are more designed to be in tighter spaces. This is Regal Prince and Kindred Spirit, and some of these vestigiate oaks that don't take up a lot of room, Green Pillar. And so you can plant the right plant in the right place by putting in some of these plants that maybe don't get as big. American elms, we know how beautiful the American elms are in Washington, D.C. And there's a lot of work being done with American elms and their disease resistance, and that's a great thing. And so elms are back, and they're very important for pollinators and birds, and that's great. And that's a success story with sustainability. You can plant small. We have a nursery up in Upper New York called Saratoga Tree Nursery that distributes, you buy and distribute a lot of native plants. And even if they're small, they will grow, and you will reforest for the next generation. Because as the great philosopher Kermit the Frog once said, it's not easy being green. Sustainability is a lot of work, it's a lot of planning, it takes time to get there. But once you get there, you have a sustainable landscape that's going to have longevity to it. It's going to be sustainable over the long term and will last the test of time and will endure, really, all this climate change we're seeing and all these extremes we're seeing. This is my latest book, which came out in the spring, on sustainable gardening. I've only really touched the surface on the subject matter in this book, but it's hard to do that in an hour lecture. But I'm sure you'll find something in this book that will be right for you for your garden. It's very detailed in the information it provides to you as home gardeners, and I very much appreciate your time today.
Thanks to everyone who was on with us today. Thank you to Vincent for taking the time and chatting with us. Thank you for this fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Have a great day, and thank you, everybody.